Welcome along to Live on Air this evening. I'm very pleased to be able to have with me the Reverend Dr. Stephen Skuce.
Yeah, so I'm an Irish Methodist minister, and I'm one of those that became a minister when I was relatively young. I did have a bit of a sort of a job or career before that, but I try and sort of gloss that over because I suppose my first job was as what I'll call a professional gambler. And as a Methodist minister, being a professional gambler isn't really a great background. I was a currency trader for a bank. I worked for a bank for 3 or 4 years, but then eventually decided gambling with people's money wasn't really the job for a young Christian. So I felt God called me into Methodist ministry and assumed I would stay in Ireland as a circuit minister, going around the various different appointments as you do. During my time training, my wife and I felt called to cross-cultural service, and eventually, we felt called to work in the Caribbean. Nice islands, well, indeed, with the tragedies of the recent hurricanes, but nice islands, climate, and so on. Who wouldn't feel called to work in Barbados for a few years? Methodist Missionary Society are one step ahead of people like me, so they appointed me to Sri Lanka. And so we spent a few years in circuit in Ireland, then spent 4 years in Sri Lanka. And like many people who do that sort of appointment, this is a life-changing experience. So I ended up for part of that appointment in a Kollupitiya Methodist church, which on a Good Friday service, the building itself will hold about 800 people. There'll be 800 people there. You'd have had about 1,000 people going through the building at the various points of worship and so on during a Sunday. Great privilege to be there, and came back, worked in a university in Ireland as a chaplain for a while. And like a lot of people who go away from their country and then come back, it's hard to settle back. And so I ended up moving with my family to England. Cliff College, I worked for a number of years, a Methodist Bible College. And for the last 3-4 years, I have worked for what we call the connectional team, the headquarters staff of the British Methodist Church, with a slightly grandiose title of Director of Scholarship, Research and Innovation. So that's the role that I currently do.
That's a wonderful title, and we'll come on to some of your research and what that entails and some of your research findings in a minute. But I wonder if we could just go back to Cliff College, and for our New Zealand folk and others overseas, explain to us what Cliff College is about.
Picture your old style, late 19th century a Methodist evangelist who produces an evangelistic newspaper and goes out and about and gives this out and tries to start conversations with people about their faith, or indeed from his perspective, their lack of faith. He then trains a small group of people to help him distribute this newspaper, and lo and behold, starts a small college to train them. Cliff College begins, founded by an evangelistic newspaper called the Joyful News. Carries on over the next, it really begins as a formal college in 1904. And it continues for the next, I suppose, 80 years, 75, 80 years, for a 1-year course training young men and women, normally who come late teens, early 20s, normally with very little educational background. They're sort of, if you like, rough diamonds that then get polished at Cliff College and in many cases become tremendous servants of God for the rest of their lives and go into all sorts of areas across the world. Some will have ended up in New Zealand, and they're there. They're evangelists, whether they're employed as evangelists or they're a school teacher or a clerk or whatever it is. They're evangelists. Over the last 25 years, like almost all what you'll call traditional Bible colleges, we've had to change, and we now have people who do an undergraduate theology degree. It's focused on mission, but it does look quite mainstream as well. We've got a part-time undergraduate degree in mission and ministry, which is sort of youth workers, children's workers, those that work with older people, outreach workers will do. And then we've got a master's in mission program and a PhD program. So from moving from a Bible college where people came for 1 year with no educational background, our biggest program today is our masters, and people doing PhDs. So we're a little microcosm of the change in what you might call evangelical theological education in Britain. We've moved away, I think, unfortunately, but inevitably, from being able to accept people with no educational background to actually needing people to have a decent educational background. Cliff College degrees are validated by the University of Manchester. We have to meet their standards. So that's the sort of world that we now live in. Previously, it was a simpler age, but, we all have to, you have to find new ways as circumstances change in order to, to serve your present age.
Yeah, that's a good line from a Charles Wesley hymn, isn't it? Finding the way to serve the present age. That leads on quite naturally to the fact that you are appointed as a researcher, and presumably that includes theological research, church growth research, contextual Bible research.
So the job I do was sort of a newly created job, and it came partly as a response to Methodism used to be involved in 10, 12 theological colleges in Britain. There were 4 or 5 colleges, some quite small, but 1 or 2 larger, that we ran ourselves. And then there were another 8 or 9 colleges where we also, some of our people training for ordination went, and we had lecturers there. So we, about 5 or so years ago, we withdrew from most of those colleges, including closing 2 or 3 of our own colleges. And the creation of my post was an attempt to, so we haven't withdrawn from theological education. We've focused our training of ministers in one college, and we work with lay people and those already ordained doing their masters and so on at Cliff College. So we've got sort of 2 colleges that we work with, but we need to keep in touch with higher education. We need to keep in touch with research. So my job was partly to make links with lots of universities and colleges and sort of keep Methodism in touch with what's going on. But the other part of the role is doing research projects that the Methodist Church asks for. Now, the key is in the Methodist Church asks for. So I don't really have the liberty to, just research anything that I might on a whim think it'd be a good idea if we knew a little bit more about whatever the subject. So a lot of what I'm asked to do is looking at, it's missiology of one sort or another. It's looking at the impact of church programs, church policies, church decisions. We've had for generations quite a sophisticated statistics department. So we would maybe want to say, or others would point to us and say, we're as good as it comes in the British church at keeping our statistics. So if a colleague, that's their full-time role. And then there's myself and another colleague who get involved in the, I suppose, what you'd call the church impact, the missiological research projects. But what we don't do is do, if you like, abstract theological sort of research, speculation, discussion. So you're not going to find us issuing papers on, say, Christology in the 21st century. That's not my area. We do have our Faith and Order department and our Faith and Order committee, and they will, in responding to church needs, they'll come up with, our latest theological thinking. So I think my research is primarily into the impact of different programs and policies that the church is undertaking.
That's a very helpful response. And it leads me to ask how well is the Methodist scene, how good, how vibrant is the Methodist scene in Britain? Because at least off the raw numbers, it appears to have either misplaced or lost some 350,000 members in, say, the last 20, 30 years. So there's been, a very sharp decline. I suspect that's true of all the older denominations.
To the early 1960s, there were approximately 700,000 Methodists. Today, or rather last year, 2016, there were 188,000 Methodists. So in the last 60 years, we've lost 500,000 members. Now, and we're following a similar trajectory to, the Reformed Church, United Reformed Church, which came together from the Presbyterian and Congregational. to the Church of England, certainly as regards to the worshipping communities, to a lot of the historic old-fashioned denominations. I mean, we are, whatever spin we want to put it, we are Victorian institutions that it's quite complicated to join. And people don't join with as much enthusiasm today. So we could talk for the next hour about all the reasons why we're declining. But so, you know, we in a sense we know a lot of these things. My main interest is, how do we respond to that? What's the way forward? Because it's not simply charting the decline. What's the way forward? So about 10 or so, well, it's probably 15 years ago, British Methodism brought in a sort of a program called Regrouping for Mission. 15 years ago, British Methodism had probably 700 circuits, 600, 700 circuits. What about 700 of those? If you have got 1,500 ministers and you've got 700 superintendent ministers, i.e. middle managers, for want of a better word, it's unlikely, in my opinion, that if you've got 1,500 staff, ministers aren't staff, if you've got 1,500 staff, are 700 of them going to be skilled middle managers? Chances are absolutely not. So one of the challenges Methodism has had is that we've had a few square pegs and round holes. We haven't necessarily had the structure that enables the gifts and abilities of all our colleagues. So we've reduced the number of circuits significantly, and that is an attempt to create bigger circuits that are financially self-sustainable, but that have a critical mass of people to do mission. So it's not just a response to ministerial staffing. It's not just a response to the actual numbers or numbers of congregations. It's trying to find a way in which we can create units that have the ability to engage in good contemporary mission. Now, in some places we have joined 2 or 3 circuits together. In some places we have joined up to 13 circuits together to become one. And this is complicated. There's, you've got different structures that come together. Leadership units have got to come together. Styles of working have got to come together. So after a 2-year research project, the profound insight from our Regrouping for Mission program is Methodism is really good in organization. We have regrouped really well. Methodism is currently really poor on mission. We have made almost no missional impact because of this change. So the change is a structural change. It's not denominational tinkering. It is quite a bit of a root and branch change that has enabled the I suppose what you'd say, the institution. It's given it another 10, 20 years of functioning life, but actually has made virtually no difference. It's made no, in research terms, it's made no difference, statistical difference, any noticeable difference in the impact of mission for the Methodist Church.
I think one of the fascinating things that's come through this answer of yours, Stephen, is the fact that there's actually a considerable loss of membership, but the church is more concerned at this stage about how it responds to that. I mean, as you said, we could do a lot of crying over spilt milk, but you've got some answers. You've been doing the research. This is what we're really interested in.
Yeah. But I think I would need to say that does the church want to know the answers? Because it would not surprise you if the Methodist Church had a risk register, and it would not surprise you if we had a risk register that our main risk is failure to make more followers of Jesus Christ. That imperils the entire future of the Methodist Church. So we don't have, our main risks are not financial, or not staffing, or not, our church buildings getting a bit old-fashioned looking and so on. Our real risk is failure to make more followers of Jesus Christ. So if that's our chief risk, are we putting the main amount of our resources and thinking and so on into that? The answer is absolutely not. Now, we are, at our recent conference, we were helpfully shocked by our statistics, even though our statistics showed exactly the same rate of decline as in the previous, we do it in 3-year blocks, as in the previous 3 years and the previous 3 years before that. So we have known the problem for, well, we've been declining since the 1960s, and we've been declining as a percentage of the population since the 1850s. So we've known all about this, and we actually aren't doing a whole lot about this. So in a rare little moment of sort of freedom to act, which I slightly slipped through the bureaucratic system, but let's not worry about that, I arranged a research project in one part of England that was looking at growing Methodist churches, because there's currently a bit over 4,000 Methodist congregations. The statistics will show that 2,000 of those are declining in every area of life. But it's a more nuanced picture in another 2,000 of them. For some, your membership might be declining, but actually your Sunday worship might be growing a little bit. In some, it's the other way round. And in a very small number, your membership and Sunday attendance are both growing. Whenever I was a circuit minister in Ireland, we were blessed to be in one circuit where our main church did have quite a bit of growth. And again, when I worked in Sri Lanka, the denomination is significantly growing there. So perhaps I've had the privilege of being involved where there's been growing Methodism. And I'm aware that most of my colleagues in Britain have not had that privilege, and sort of there's a bit of a lack of confidence. So what I wanted to do was tell the story of where there is growing Methodism and what do we learn, what principles are found there. So we have this at your screen, which was simply it's a little small research project. This is available online. I chose the northeast of England. There'll be some of the listeners here are perhaps originally from the northeast of England or have got some family here. So don't be insulted by what I'm saying. I'm from Ireland. It's pretty miserable. I chose the northeast of England because it doesn't have any obvious advantages. That means if a Methodist church is growing there, the rest of Britain can discount that. So, for example, there are growing Methodist churches in London. Some of the old historic Methodist churches, Wesley's Chapel, Westminster Central Hall, have grown in the last 20 years from tiny congregations of 40 and 50 people to now 300-400 people on a Sunday. But a lot of that story is to do with migration. It's not only to do with migration, but a lot of it's to do with migration into London from people from across the world. So we can, to one extent, discount that story as relevant for everywhere. So I wanted to find really ordinary Methodism and where there was growth. So anyway, the northeast of England, which has got 2 Methodist districts, there are a grand total of 293 Methodist congregations there. So I won't bore you with all the methodology, but we ended up, we had a number of indicators of growth. So it might have been membership has grown in the last 3 years or the last 5 years. It might have been average worship attendance has grown in the last 3 years or the last 5 years. We had about 5 different indicators of growth. And there were about 100 churches met at least one of those indicators of growth. But when you crunch your stuff and you looked at where you got, we ended up with doing case studies on 6 Methodist congregations. And I'll just glance back down at my own report just to remind myself. I do have one critique of my own work. There's a big number of small Methodist congregations. So of the 6 churches we looked at, one of those churches had 8 members. There was at least another one was the low 30s. I'm just trying to find the right numbers here. But there were others that were there's one at over 100. There was a couple of them were in the 60s or 70s. If you're in England today and you're a Methodist church with 60 or 70 people showing up on a Sunday morning, you're a relatively large Methodist church, even though by other standards this is a small church. 60 or 70 is seen as that is a thriving Methodist church. That's
incredible.
Well, yeah, it is. It is. I mean, we're a denomination of small churches, but so I think we ended up looking at slightly larger churches than might have been ideal. But anyway, that's just a small, if you like, academic critique. What we ended up finding was there were 5 factors that were found in these growing Methodist churches. Now, it is obviously not as simplistic as if you do these 5 things, your church will grow. But what we can say with confidence is these 5 factors were each found in all of the growing Methodist churches that we looked at. So we can point Methodism in Britain to factors that will be useful to growth. And some of this goes. One of the reasons for doing this project is when you look at church growth literature, there's lots of factors that are found in growing Methodist churches, in growing churches. But some of this is entirely irrelevant to British Methodism. So a lot of standard church growth literature talks about longevity of whatever is the senior leadership, whether that's an individual or a small group, the longevity. That never happens in British Methodism. So there's no point in me pointing people to that. We all know, or any of those that have a bit of wit, we all know that some of Methodist structures are detrimental to growth. But there's no point in me simply regaling about things that I know at heart British Methodism is not going to change. No matter how wise it may be to change, I know that these are things that will not change in the current generation. So the research, might have pointed to that, but what I didn't want to do is produce research that was going to be discounted by most of Methodism. So anyway, we created a project that was likely to find factors that were helping ordinary Methodist churches in a very ordinary context to grow. So you don't need to be in the suburbs with a great big car park and beside a major arterial road and all that sort of stuff. That might be another church growth literature. Our 5 factors. The 5 factors were all very ordinary things. There was nothing. What it didn't say was you must become conservative evangelical. It didn't say anything about theological emphasis at all. I don't want to say that's irrelevant in growing Methodism, but it's not a significant factor. So the 5 factors, I'll try and sort of put them in the less academic language. It was being welcoming and hospitable, being responsive to the needs of the wider community. That's your social gospel that we've been engaged in since Wesley's time. Making available spiritual development opportunities, intentional spiritual development opportunities. And there are times when you challenge people to take a further step in their faith. We are looking for commitment. This is not your old style, walk up to the front and give your life to Christ. But it is making sure that people on a regular basis are aware that as I journey with Christ, as I live out my life of discipleship, there are moments when I sort of have to get out of the boat and step in the water. And we challenge people, we challenge ourselves to do this, to live our life closer with Christ than we had before. Participatory and collaborative leadership. In some Methodist churches, the minister does everything. In some Methodist churches, 2 or 3 lay leaders do everything. Neither of those are participatory or collaborative leadership. And finally, at least as crucial as the others, actively overcoming barriers to change. So where there were problems, where there were challenges, churches that grew took active steps to address those problems. They didn't just sit back and hope the problem went away or resign themselves to, well, this is the way it's always going to be. It's never going to change. They took active steps to overcome the barriers to change. And lo and behold, change happened. So that's from the northeast of England. Those are 5 factors that are found in growing British Methodist churches now. Whether that is transferable to, say, New Zealand. I mean, I know from an Irish and a Sri Lankan background, there are different factors that in Ireland, in the congregation where I was minister, when we grew, I knew there was different factors involved there. Sri Lankan Methodism, which has grown significantly as a denomination, again, different factors that are found there. And I would imagine for New Zealand, there'll be a different story. But there are some, if you like, core bits of Methodist DNA found in those factors that most Methodist churches will think they're doing, but in reality, I'll say to them, you're not. You think you are, but the problem is you're not.
Stephen, we've got some questions come through from viewers, and Max is asking, what are in the 5 factors? Are there things that don't change? Are there some constants that are helpful for church growth?
I mean, the 5 factors are not the only 5 factors that are found. And I mean, there isn't a progression in them in that you go through, you need 2 and 3, or the first 2 and 3 are in a ranking. It's not that. And I can't say that some are found to a higher degree and others to a lesser degree. So I'm not really sure how I am effectively going to answer this. To me, the fundamental thing that came out of it was these are very ordinary. These are very attainable. There's virtually no change a congregation would think we need to do in order to meet these, because, yeah, we're all welcoming. No church describes itself as, well, we are an unwelcoming congregation. Being inclusive is an absolute key sort of Methodist buzzword. Participatory leadership, things like this, overcoming change. So we think we're doing these, but the reality is we're not. And I think that so one of the risks of these findings are people say, yeah, well, we're doing that and it's not working. So therefore, so my response is to start to look more closely at each of the 5 factors with a congregation or with a circuit and help them to see, do you actually have participatory leadership? How does it work with those that are ordained or full-time lay workers and lay leaders? How does that relationship go? Is one active, one passive? Is it participatory? Because in the churches that were growing, this was found to a high degree, real, proper, participatory leadership. So it's. So none of the factors are more important than any other, I think. And we could have used 7 or 8 factors, but those were the 5 key factors. But it's trying to just help people to look at them more closely and just ask the hard critical questions and see how do we help develop what we're doing in order to live out these, because they are sort of more principles, ways to being rather than things we must do. How do we live this out better as a church community?
Well, Stuart Mannins is asking whether there's, he's asking, is there a progression in the 5 factors? From the little that I've heard, just while you were talking, they do seem to be interrelated, but I'm not, what's your opinion? Does one progress to the next?
No, I don't think they progress to the next, but absolutely they are interrelated, and we'd use phrases like it's a virtuous cycle, and they have to interrelate to each other. They can't be they can't be standalone. So yeah, they do impact each other, but yeah, it's not you get the first 2 out of the way and then you can move on to the next one. It's got to be all sort of
yeah. I like that idea of the virtuous cycle or virtuous circle. I did a little video on that actually a few weeks ago, and it's when one comes to understand the ethics and how normalcy can impact on itself, if you like, so that a congregation becomes more and more ethical the more and more ethics that it practices. The congregation becomes more and more evangelical the more and more it practices being evangelical, and so on. But no one thing can operate independently in terms of getting that circle or cycle effect going. You need a lot of things interacting. Max has asked about, you've mentioned meeting community needs. How do you go about measuring community needs?
Yeah. Okay. So, well, in the issue of community needs, this is one of the ways in which I think British Methodism is actually quite strong. So, of those 4,000 Methodist chapels, I'm sure at least half of them, and I do mean half of them, have got one or more community projects that they're doing to help meet some of the physical, emotional needs of people in the wider community. So I live just outside London, just outside London in a town called Basingstoke. I'm looking at the moment at what is one of the less beautiful Methodist churches in Britain. I don't want to call it one of the ugliest, but if there was a prize for it, it would certainly be a runner. This is a 1960s housing estate, and the church, which has got a congregation of about 25 or 30, it's quite a changing congregation. But it's very hard at times to get parked in the car park here, because throughout the day there's a preschool group that meets sort of 8 until 5. Every evening there's various community groups use the premises. On a Saturday morning there's groups use the premises. It's in use all the time. So a little small congregation, helping through facilities meet some of the community needs. It's very, very common for our tiny little Methodist chapels to have coffee mornings, to have mothers and toddlers, to have to have food banks, that type of project. As another example, the little Methodist church, which I'm sort of connected with again, 20 people tops. One of the couples out of that church are largely responsible for the creation of a homeless shelter in our town, which has been going for 30 years, meets the needs of probably 25, 30 people now. And this is a major, major project. Another couple in that church, every first Sunday, they put on a lunch for whoever wants to come. And a number of those are members of the church and members of the wider community, often people who are on their own or quite elderly. They produce your standard good old British Sunday lunch, and people make small donations. Those donations go largely to help a project in Zambia, where it's the rehabilitation of prisoners. It's not a particularly dramatic, glamorous work. The rehabilitation of prisoners in Zambia. So these are tiny little churches where the physical needs, emotional needs of the wider community are being met from congregations with often 20 old people. So British Methodism is quite good at this. I mean, I think the answer, how do we measure the community needs, is if we're not part of the community, we won't be able to measure the community needs. We are not some sort of abstract body that comes from outside and looks at the local community and thinks, well, what do you need? And we'll do a community audit and so on. If we have to do that, we're not part of the community. So because in most cases we are part of the community, we know what the needs of the community are, but also one of the challenges for Methodism is, what can we realistically meet? We know the gospel compels us to show God's love to those around us. And at times we want to do more than we can. So some congregations just have to be more realistic at what they're able to achieve and to focus on one or two areas. But one of the growing churches, what they saw was in the local community, very disadvantaged area in the northeast, the local Methodist deacon who called with a family who weren't part of the church and realised that when we went through the door, there was no furniture in the home, or basically no furniture in the home. Why is that? Because the bailiffs had come the day before. This was coming up to Christmas and taken everything. And there was a family, his mother, 2 or 3 children, and almost nothing in the house. Surely we can do something to help. But rather than, so church members, let's raise a bit of money, let's buy a bit of furniture. No. Church members and members of the local community have no connection with the church at all, making a wider group, being partners with others, making wider groups involved in what we're trying to do. And so that became, instead of just getting a bit of furniture and a Christmas hamper for that family, it turned out, if I remember the details of the story anyway, right, Christmas hampers for 10 families, and then it grew and it grew and it grew. And then the classic thing starts to happen is people start to say, so why are you doing this? Now, this is where British Methodism often fails. We are showing God's love in the wider community. People are being impacted in a positive way. Some of their social needs are being met. They recognise that the church these are good people. These are trying to help me and those around me. These are good people. What British Methodism in the last generation or two has been really poor at doing is being able to talk about our faith. It's not imposing our faith on others, it's responding to questions. We've been poor at that. That's one of the areas that I'm trying to encourage us, many others are trying to encourage us to develop. We had a conference report in 1999, Time to Talk of God. It reminded us that one of our key problems was we need more confidence to talk about our faith. We still need a lot more confidence to talk about our faith. And that, I think, is one of the challenges that we need to overcome.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on, because it has a challenge to it, Stephen, that I think is replicated by findings in the New Zealand Methodist Church over a number of decades, that many in a congregation are not necessarily reluctant to share their faith, but not necessarily confident about doing it. It's become something that is less obviously well done compared to, say, in previous generations. So there's such a lot in what you've been saying. I really want to say thank you very much indeed, because it's been a marvellous session. And I wonder if you would mind at some point in the future if we came back and did some further work with you, because there's such a lot of good, practical, applicable theology that makes faith in action that we could certainly use in discussions in our local congregation.
Thank you very much. It's been my great pleasure to share with you from a bit of a distance away. And I mean, this broadcast, it's an excellent sort of tool to help sort of keep theological conversations going amongst a group of people. And my privilege to share in this, and look forward to doing so again if there's ever any opportunity. Thank you very much.